I never thought this story would happen to me before. This is how it all unraveled. Paige and I had been together for quite a while before things started to shift. Then came the big break. She got this prestigious job offer from a top-tier law firm. A dream opportunity, the kind of career move most people only fantasize about. At the time, we were living in a cozy little town, and life was simple, steady. I had my job, a circle of friends, and my family nearby. It wasn't anything extraordinary, but it was home. Paige, though? She was different. Always pushing herself, always talking about making partner, climbing the ranks, and becoming someone important. And of course, I had her back. I mean, isn't that what a good husband does? But when that offer came in, it wasn't just her life that changed, it was ours. The position was in another city, far away. Paige was over the moon, practically glowing with excitement. Me? I felt like my world was being ripped apart. My family, my friends, everything familiar. It was all slipping through my fingers. But I didn't speak up. I couldn't be the guy who held her back. We were a team, right? At least that's what I kept telling myself. So we packed up our life and moved to the big city. It was thrilling in a way, but also overwhelming. The skyscrapers, the noise, the constant rush, it was a lot. And almost as soon as we arrived, it felt like I'd barely recognized Paige anymore. She threw herself into her new job with an intensity I'd never seen before. Late nights, endless talk about legal cases and partners, and piles of paperwork became her world. I'd catch glimpses of her at the end of the day, but it was like she was light years away. Meanwhile, I was struggling to find my footing. Job hunting in a new city wasn't easy. I sent out resumes, went to interviews, and after what felt like an eternity, I landed a position at a marketing firm. It wasn't what I'd envisioned for myself, but it was something. It paid the bills. The downside? My boss, Brad, was a nightmare. The kind of guy who nitpicks everything and makes you feel like you can't do anything right. He'd summon me into his office, dissect my work, and make me feel 2 inches tall. It was draining. And then I'd come home, only to see Paige thriving in her career while I was barely holding on. At first, I told myself Paige was just under a lot of pressure. She was working long hours and coming home completely drained. I tried to be supportive. I even cooked dinner sometimes, though I'm no chef. I made an effort to keep our conversations alive, to keep things normal between us. But she wasn't interested. Some nights, she'd sit at the table, eat in silence, and then disappear behind her laptop as if I didn't exist. I kept convincing myself it was just her job. She was adjusting to the demands, and things would settle down eventually. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. It wasn't just work consuming her attention. It felt like she was pulling away from me entirely. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to find her glued to her phone or typing furiously on her laptop. We barely spoke anymore. The woman I married, the one I used to laugh with and share everything with, was slipping away, and I didn't know how to stop it. There was this invisible barrier growing between us, brick by brick, and no matter what I did, I couldn't break through. And the worst part? I couldn't bring myself to say anything. What was I supposed to do? Tell her she was distant and I felt like I was losing her? That would have sounded pathetic. So I bottled it up. I convinced myself I was overthinking, that maybe I was just being paranoid. After all, she was working hard for us, for our future. That's what I kept telling myself every day, even though that gnawing feeling wouldn't go away. I'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering where it all went wrong. We were supposed to be in this together, but I felt like I was playing this game alone. And then, there were the comparisons. How could I not? Paige was crushing it, climbing the corporate ladder, impressing all the right people, while I was getting chewed out by Brad like some amateur. The imbalance started eating away at me that I knew I should have been happy for Paige, even proud of her accomplishments. But how could I feel that way when my own life was unraveling? Every time I watched her throw herself into her work with such determination, it made me feel small. Like I wasn't enough, like I wasn't even a real man. She never directly said or did anything to make me feel that way, but her actions screamed louder than any words could. Her career had become the center of her world, and I felt like a bystander, clinging to the hope of achieving something remotely meaningful myself. There were so many nights I thought about sitting her down, having a real conversation about the growing chasm between us. But then she'd walk through the door, exhausted, her eyes glued to her laptop before she even set her bag down. I'd tell myself she didn't need my problems piled onto her already overwhelming workload. She didn't need me whining about my feelings when she was drowning in deadlines and cases. So, I swallowed it all, but the resentment started eating away at me. Deep down, I knew something was wrong, but I wasn't ready to face it. Once you admit something is broken, it's out there, you can't take it back. And so, there I was, stuck in a city I didn't want to be in, working a job I despised, married to a woman who felt more like a stranger with each passing day. But despite everything, I clung to hope, foolish, naive hope. I convinced myself that once Paige settled into her job, things would get better. We'd find our way back to each other. I told myself it was just a phase, that the distance between us would eventually shrink. What I didn't realize was that the worst was still to come. As the holidays approached, my company announced its annual end-of-year corporate party. It was one of those events where attendance was pretty much mandatory, and spouses were expected to join. I saw it as a chance to turn things around. Brad, my nitpicking boss, had been making my life miserable, and I thought maybe this party could help me prove to him that I wasn't the screw-up he seemed to think I was. On top of that, I hoped bringing Paige along might give us a chance to reconnect. Things had been tense between us, and I was desperate for something, anything that might help us reset. But when I brought it up to Paige, her reaction wasn't exactly enthusiastic. She gave me that look, the one that silently screamed, "Are you kidding me?" She explained that her plate was already overflowing with work, her deadlines looming closer every second. I wasn't surprised. Lately, she'd been glued to her laptop, working day and night, and the only conversations we had revolved around her cases. Still, I pushed. I told her it would be good for us to take a break, step away from the grind, and actually spend some time together. She hesitated, clearly torn. But after a moment, she sighed and agreed. Honestly, I felt relieved. Like maybe this was the break we needed. Maybe, for one night, things could feel normal again. I needed this night to go well. The party felt like a chance to finally catch a break. Still, as we headed there, I couldn't shake my nerves, not because of Paige, but because of Brad. From the moment I started at the firm, he'd been a constant thorn in my side, always finding something to criticize, no matter how minor. My goal for the night was simple: survive without him tearing into me. If I could pull that off, I'd consider it a win. When we arrived, the venue was already buzzing with people. The crowd was a mix of tipsy laughter, overly loud chatter, and plastered-on smiles. The kind you see when everyone's pretending to enjoy themselves because the boss is watching. It was the usual corporate charade. I grabbed a drink for Paige and tried to introduce her to a few of my coworkers. She wasn't exactly thrilled. I could see it in her expression. This wasn't her scene, and these weren't her kind of people. Couldn't blame her. Even I felt out of place. Still, I held out hope that as the night progressed, she might relax a little and join in. At one point, I left her for a moment to grab more drinks. I was gone for 5 minutes, tops. But when I came back, I spotted her deep in conversation with Brad. Something about the sight of them together instantly put me on edge. They weren't doing anything inappropriate. It was just a simple conversation. But the way she was smiling at him, laughing at whatever joke he'd cracked, didn't sit right with me. I tried to keep my cool as I approached, acting like it didn't bother me. As soon as I reached them, Brad turned to me with this slick grin on his face and said, "You've got a great wife, Oscar." On the surface, it sounded like a compliment. But the tone, the way he said it, made my skin crawl. It was as if he knew something I didn't, like there was a joke I wasn't in on. What could I do? Call him out for complimenting my wife? So I forced a smile, made some awkward small talk, and moved on. But that strange, uncomfortable feeling stuck with me for the rest of the evening. After the party, things started to shift in an unexpected way. Brad, the man who had been a constant critic, suddenly became my biggest fan. It was almost overnight. He stopped nitpicking every detail of my work and began praising my ideas during meetings. It didn't feel real. Then, out of nowhere, he called me into his office and offered me a promotion. Just like that. I should have been ecstatic, but instead, I felt uneasy. The promotion had come too easily, too conveniently. I hadn't done anything exceptional to earn it, at least not in my eyes. Still, I didn't question it. After months of feeling like I couldn't catch a break, finally being recognized felt amazing. For the first time since we moved here, I was succeeding. I convinced myself I deserved it. After all, hadn't I worked hard? But even as my career started to take an upward turn, things with Paige were deteriorating faster than ever. The distance between us had become undeniable. She stopped sharing anything about her day with me. When I asked about her cases or how work was going, she'd respond with short, clipped answers that felt colder than ever. It was as if she didn't even want to engage with me. The more I tried to connect, the more she seemed to shut me out. And no matter how much success I was starting to find at work, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing her for good. It wasn't just our conversations that had dried up. Our entire relationship felt like it was crumbling. Paige spent more and more time at work, and even when she was home, she was practically glued to her phone or laptop. Some nights, she wouldn't even come to bed until well after midnight. When I tried to bring it up, she'd wave me off, saying I was reading too much into things. But I wasn't. Something was off, I could feel it. I just couldn't pinpoint what it was. I kept telling myself it was nothing more than a rough patch. She was under a lot of stress, and this was just temporary. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself, a small voice in the back of my mind wouldn't let it go. Something had shifted, and it wasn't just about her job. Maybe it was the way Brad had looked at her during the party, or maybe it was how she'd been acting ever since that night. I didn't know for sure, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The worst part? I had no proof, nothing solid to base my doubts on. It was all gut instinct, a nagging, relentless feeling I couldn't ignore. Every time she stayed late at work or brushed off my questions, the unease inside me grew stronger. I tried to focus on the positive, on my promotion, on the fact that things were finally starting to improve for me at work. But the doubts were always there, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. And here's the thing. Once you start doubting someone you love, it's like a poison. It spreads, corrupting everything it touches. I'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering where she was, what she was doing, or who she might be with. Every time her phone buzzed in the middle of the night, I'd feel a pang of suspicion. Was it just a work email? Or was it something else? I hated myself for thinking that way, but I couldn't stop. I didn't know how to bring it up with her. Without any real evidence, what could I say? If I asked, she'd just dismiss it, say I was being ridiculous or paranoid. Maybe I was being paranoid, but that nagging doubt refused to leave me alone. So I stayed quiet. I kept telling myself that it was just a phase, that things would get better with time. I threw myself into my work, into the promotion, anything to distract myself from the creeping distance between us. But no matter how hard I tried, I could feel us drifting further apart. Deep down, I knew we were heading towards something worse. That's when I came up with what I thought was a solution, a way to put my fears to rest. I decided to invite Brad and his wife, Ella, over for dinner. It seemed like the perfect plan. If I could get Brad into our home and see how he acted around Paige, maybe I'd realize I was just imagining things. It also felt like a chance to smooth things over with Brad, to build a better rapport with my boss. I told myself it was the right thing to do, that it would ease my doubts. But deep down, I wasn't so sure that I kept telling myself that if I could maintain a professional, smooth relationship at work, maybe everything else would start to fall into place. But Paige? She wasn't exactly enthusiastic about hosting Brad and his wife for dinner. "You know how busy I am, Oscar," she said, her tone dripping with irritation, as if I was being unreasonable for even asking. Still, I managed to convince her it was important. I framed it as a necessary step for my career, and maybe for us too. The night of the dinner arrived, and at first, everything seemed normal. I greeted Brad and Ella at the door with my best attempt at a calm smile, though internally, I was overanalyzing every detail. Every glance, every interaction between Paige and Brad felt like it carried extra weight. Paige was in her element, playing the part of the perfect hostess. She smiled effortlessly, poured drinks, and even made small talk with Ella, as if everything was perfectly fine. For a brief moment, I let myself believe that it was all in my head, that I'd imagined the tension. But as the evening progressed, I began to notice the subtle things, the little details that made my stomach churn. Brad would glance at Paige, but not in a casual or friendly way. His gaze lingered just a second too long, carrying an unspoken familiarity that I couldn't ignore. And Paige? She wasn't exactly discouraging it. The way they talked, the ease with which their conversation flowed, it was like they were on a different wavelength, one I wasn't part of. They kept steering the conversation back to work, their cases, their goals, their shared ambitions. Meanwhile, Ella and I might as well have been furniture in the background. I kept trying to convince myself it was nothing, that I was overreacting. But with every passing moment, the knot in my chest grew tighter. That gnawing feeling, the one I'd been trying so hard to suppress, clawed its way back to the surface. When the night finally ended and Brad and Ella left, I turned to Paige, searching for something, some reassurance, some acknowledgement of the evening. All I got was a half-hearted, "It was fine." Then, without missing a beat, she opened her laptop and got back to work as if nothing had happened. I just sat there, staring at her. She was physically in front of me, but it felt like she was already a million miles away. The connection, the trust, it was unraveling, slipping further out of reach with every second. A few days later, something unexpected happened. Brad didn't show up to work. Normally, I wouldn't have thought much of it, but with my mind already on edge, it sent me spiraling. I emailed him about a project, expecting a quick reply, but hours passed without a word. Panicked, I tried calling Paige. I dialed her number once. No answer. I called again. Straight to voicemail. That familiar, gnawing anxiety clawed its way back. The one I'd been trying to push aside for weeks hit me like a freight train. My chest tightened, my thoughts spiraling into the worst possible scenarios. I couldn't stop imagining things I didn't want to imagine. Couldn't stop my heart from pounding as if it were bracing for something inevitable. When I finally got home that evening, Paige was already in bed, but my mind was anything but quiet. It was a storm, a chaotic, swirling mess of doubt, fear, and anger. I sat in the darkness, my thoughts racing, unable to escape the feeling that everything I'd been trying to hold together was about to shatter. I couldn't take it anymore. The questions, the doubts, they were eating me alive. I had to know the truth. No more wondering, no more sleepless nights. My heart pounded as I walked into our bedroom. Paige was sound asleep, her breathing steady and peaceful. Her phone was there on the nightstand, charging. I froze, staring at it. My hands trembled so much it felt like I was paralyzed. I had never even considered crossing this line before, never even thought about invading her privacy. But tonight, something inside me broke. I couldn't hold back anymore. I needed to know. After what felt like an eternity, I picked up her phone. My hands shook as I unlocked it and navigated to her messages. My chest tightened, every breath harder than the last. And then I saw it, the conversation with Brad. As I scrolled through, my whole body felt like it was on fire. These weren't just casual texts. They were flirtatious, intimate, explicit, and cruel. They weren't just talking about their affair. They were mocking me. Brad had called me a loser, a clueless idiot who didn't deserve Paige. And Paige? She didn't defend me. She laughed. She joked about how easy it was to hide everything from me. Brad bragged about how good it felt to be with her, how they had to be discreet because of their jobs. But it was worth the risk. Paige responded with emojis, flirty comments, and words that turned my stomach. In that moment, everything around me shattered. My world, the one I thought I knew, was gone. The ground beneath my feet felt like it was crumbling. I had been blind, ignoring all the signs, convincing myself I was overthinking. But I wasn't. I had been right all along. And now the proof was staring me in the face. The woman I had sacrificed so much for, the woman I had loved with everything I had betrayed me in the worst possible way. I wanted to scream. I wanted to wake her up and demand answers. I wanted to throw her phone against the wall, to watch it break into a million pieces, just like she'd shattered my trust. But I didn't. Something held me back. Maybe it was shock, or maybe it was the quiet, calculated part of my mind telling me to stay in control. I couldn't lose it, not yet. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I placed her phone back exactly where I found it and slipped out of the room as quietly as I could. My heart was still racing, but now the anger, the pain, it was transforming into something colder. Something sharper. A dark, steady voice in my head whispered, "Don't let them know you know." Not yet. I needed time. I needed a plan. If Paige and Brad thought they could humiliate me, that they could get away with this, they were in for a rude awakening. I wasn't going to sit back and be the guy they laughed at. I wasn't going to let them make me their fool. No, I was going to make them regret every single thing. I went downstairs and sat at the kitchen table, my mind racing. I stared at my coffee like it could somehow give me the answers I needed. Part of me wanted to confront Paige right away, shake her awake and scream at her, demand she explain everything. But deep down, I knew that wouldn't solve anything. I couldn't just blow up without a plan. This needed to be handled the right way. Confronting Paige right away would have been a mistake. It would only give her and Brad the chance to deny everything, spin their lies, and cover their tracks. No, I needed something bigger. Something they couldn't explain away. That's when I thought of Ella, Brad's wife. If I was going to take them down, I couldn't do it alone. I needed someone who had just as much on the line as I did. And Ella? She had no idea what was happening behind her back. Or at least, that's what I assumed. That morning, I sent her a message, keeping it vague. I said I needed to talk about something work-related and asked if we could meet. She agreed, probably thinking it was about Brad or some mundane office matter. We decided on a quiet cafe downtown, somewhere out of the way, where we wouldn't risk running into anyone we knew. The last thing I needed was for word to get back to Paige before I was ready. When I arrived, Ella was already there, seated at a small table by the window. She looked as composed as ever, the kind of person who always seemed to have everything in perfect order. But as I sat down and met her gaze, I could sense something beneath her polished exterior. Maybe she already knew, or maybe it was just that instinct we all have when something in our marriage feels wrong. Whatever it was, what I was about to show her would shatter her world. "Thanks for meeting me," I said, doing my best to steady my voice, though my hands were shaking under the table. This was it, there'd be no going back once I started. She smiled, but I could see the confusion in her eyes. "Of course. Is everything okay?" she asked cautiously. I didn't waste any time. I pulled out my phone, unlocked it, and slid it across the table. "Take a look at this." Ella picked up the phone, her brow furrowing as she began to read the messages. For a few moments, her face remained blank, as if her mind was struggling to process what she was seeing. Then the emotions came, one after another: shock, hurt, and finally anger. "He's been with her," she whispered, her voice cracking. She looked up at me, her eyes brimming with tears. "How long has this been going on?" "I don't know," I said, shaking my head. "But now we have proof." She leaned back in her chair, blinking rapidly as if trying to push back the tears. Her hands gripped the edge of the table tightly. After a long, heavy pause, she spoke quietly. "I've always had a feeling. Brad's been different for months, but I never had anything concrete. Not until now." The silence that followed was suffocating. It wasn't the awkward kind. It was the kind that happens when two people's worlds have just been ripped apart, and they're trying to figure out what's left. And then, something in her changed. I saw it happen like a switch flipping. Her devastation turned into something sharper. It was fury, the same kind of fire I'd felt when I first saw those messages. "We can't let them get away with this," she said, her voice calm but cutting, full of determination. I nodded, feeling my own anger reignite. "I've been thinking the same thing. We need a plan." That's when the idea came to us, the cameras. It was perfect. They thought they were so clever, sneaking around behind our backs, confident they could keep it hidden. But if we could catch them in the act, if we could get undeniable proof, they wouldn't be able to deny it anymore. The text messages were damning, sure, but video evidence? That would seal their fate. "We'll set up cameras in both our bedrooms," Ella said, her voice colder now, filled with a steely resolve. That's where they think they're safe, where they think they can hide. I nodded in agreement. It was risky, but it was exactly what we needed. They had no idea what was coming, but soon enough, they'd realize just how wrong they were. We'll catch them there, I said, nodding firmly. There was no hesitation now. This wasn't just about confronting Paige anymore. It was about reclaiming control, about ensuring they couldn't weasel their way out of this with excuses or lies. It wasn't going to be easy, but I didn't care. They had betrayed us, humiliated us, and they were going to face the consequences. The rest of the day was a blur of planning. Ella and I went out that afternoon to buy the cameras. Small, discreet, impossible to detect. She was cold and methodical as we discussed the details, her focus unshakable. There was a fire in her eyes, a determination that mirrored my own. She wasn't going to let this go, and neither was I. If anything, her resolve seemed even stronger than mine. That night, I installed the camera in our bedroom. Every second of it felt like a knife twisting in my gut. The idea of spying on Paige in our own home made me sick to my stomach. But I kept reminding myself, this was the only way to get the undeniable proof I needed. Around Paige, I acted like nothing was wrong. I smiled when I needed to, made small talk, pretended everything was fine. But inside I was seething. Rage, betrayal, and heartbreak churned in me constantly, but I couldn't let it show. Not yet. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest of my life. Each night, I'd lie in bed, wondering if that would be the night they slipped up. I had to maintain the charade, keep up appearances, all while waiting for the truth to finally come to light. Ella and I stayed in close contact, updating each other on every minor detail. But mostly we waited, and waited. It was torturous. And then, at last, the moment came. One night, after what felt like an eternity of waiting, I got the notification on my phone from the camera. My heart pounded as I opened the app. Paige was home, but I wasn't. I could hardly breathe as the feed loaded. And there they were, Paige and Brad, together in our bedroom. I couldn't watch for long. The sight of it was like a dagger through my chest. But I didn't need to see any more. I had all the proof I needed. I called Ella immediately, my voice shaking with anger and disgust. She was already checking her own camera feed, and sure enough, she confirmed it. Brad had been at her house the same day, sneaking around in their bedroom. It was almost poetic, in the most sickening, twisted way imaginable. The next day, we met again at the same cafe. But this time, everything felt different. We weren't just two betrayed spouses anymore. We were partners now, allies, a team with a shared mission. I've got the footage, I said, sliding my phone across the table. Ella looked at the video, her face hardening as she nodded. So do I. Now what? I leaned back in my chair, trying to steady the storm of emotions inside me. Now, I said, my voice cold and steady. We make them regret ever thinking they could get away with this. We spent hours going over the plan, dissecting every detail, preparing for every possible way things could go wrong. There were risks, of course, plenty of them, but I didn't care anymore. I was done being reasonable, done trying to make sense of what had happened. I wanted revenge. I wanted Paige and Brad to feel every ounce of the pain they'd inflicted on us. When we left the cafe that day, there was only one thing on our minds: making them pay. This wasn't going to be easy, but it was necessary. They had torn our lives apart, destroyed our trust, and shattered everything we thought we could count on. Now, it was time for them to face the consequences. They had made their choices, and they were about to pay the price. The hotel room felt cold and sterile, its impersonal decor doing little to offer any comfort. The faint smell of fresh linens hung in the air, but it didn't mask the weight of what we were here to do. When Ella suggested we meet at a hotel, I hadn't been sure what to expect, but I understood why she chose it. Our homes were filled with too much history, too many emotions. We needed neutral ground, a place detached from everything to think clearly. Or at least that was the idea. Ella sat across from me, her presence heavy with everything we'd endured. The silence between us was thick, almost suffocating. a storm cloud on the verge of bursting. We had the evidence now. The videos. The proof. The undeniable truth. It was only a matter of time before Paige and Brad would be forced to face what they had done. Ella broke the tension by pouring us each a drink. "Whiskey? No ice?" she asked. I wasn't much of a drinker, but right then, it seemed like the only thing that could cut through the suffocating weight of the moment. "To freedom," she said, raising her glass. Her eyes gleamed with something dark and raw. It wasn't joy or relief. It was something deeper, more primal. Vindication, perhaps, but also pain. "To freedom," I echoed, though the words felt hollow. I wanted to believe in the idea of freedom. Freedom from the lies, from the betrayal, but it still felt distant, like something I couldn't fully grasp. The whiskey burned as it went down, but I barely noticed. My mind was elsewhere. We spent the next hour going over the plan, refining every detail. The videos would be uploaded to a secure site and shared anonymously with the right people. Once they were out, there would be no escaping the fallout. Paige and Brad's affair would be exposed for the world to see. Their carefully constructed lives, their careers, their reputations, their lies would crumble, just as they had crumbled everything we had built. But as we spoke, the atmosphere in the room began to shift. The whiskey blurred the edges of my thoughts, softening the lines of logic and reason. The tension between Ella and me changed, too. It wasn't just about anger or revenge anymore. Something darker was bubbling to the surface. Something primal and raw, born from months of pain and frustration. We poured another drink, then another, losing track of how many. The counting didn't matter anymore. Neither did anything else. We were running on fumes, on the seething rage and heartbreak that had consumed us for so long. The alcohol stripped everything down, leaving us exposed, raw nerves laid bare. I could see it in her eyes. The same hurt, the same fury, and I knew she could see it in mine. At some point, she moved closer. Her knee brushed against mine under the table, and I froze. I should have pulled away. I knew that. Every rational part of me screamed to take a step back, to stop this before it went too far. But I didn't. I stayed. In that moment, I wasn't thinking about right or wrong. I wasn't thinking at all. The weight of everything we had endured had pushed us to the edge, and neither of us could look away that I wasn't thinking clearly anymore. My thoughts were a chaotic swirl of everything I had lost, everything Paige had destroyed. She had chosen someone else, turned me into a fool, and ripped apart the life we had built together. Anger and pain churned in me, and amidst it all, a small, selfish thought crept in. Maybe I deserved something for myself, something untainted by betrayal, something that wasn't broken. Ella leaned in, her voice soft but piercing. "We've both been through hell," she murmured, her breath warm against my ear. "Maybe we deserve better." I didn't respond. Couldn't. My mind was a haze of alcohol, rage, and the weight of what she was implying. The choice hanging in the air was suffocating, pressing down on me. Before I could stop myself, the words slipped out, unbidden. "Maybe we do." She kissed me. This time it wasn't hesitant or tentative. It was raw, urgent, fueled by everything we'd been bottling up. It wasn't love, far from it. It was something darker, a twisted blend of revenge, anger, and a desperate attempt to feel anything other than the hollow emptiness we'd both been carrying. For a moment, I pulled back, my conscience screaming at me. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was the last shred of decency trying to claw its way to the surface.
Ella.
"We shouldn't," I muttered, my voice shaky, but she silenced me with a whisper, her tone hard and unrelenting. "They did this to us, Oscar. They made us feel this way. We deserve this." And she was right, wasn't she? Paige and Brad had destroyed everything. Our trust, our lives, our sense of self, and left us with nothing. Why shouldn't we take something back? Just this once? Before I could overthink it, I grabbed my phone, opened the app, and pressed the button that sent the videos. With one click, it was done. The footage of Paige and Brad caught in their lies was out there, uploaded and distributed. There was no turning back now. A strange, twisted satisfaction washed over me. They were finally going to face the consequences. They were going to pay for what they had done. And then, everything blurred completely. Ella and I crossed the line, fully and irreversibly. It wasn't romantic or tender. It was fueled by months of anger, desperation, and betrayal. Neither of us was thinking about the fallout. We didn't care about the consequences. All that mattered was how it felt to finally reclaim something that had been stolen from us. Afterward, the room was silent. Ella lay beside me, her breathing uneven, but neither of us said a word. We didn't need to. What had just happened wasn't about us. It was about them, Paige and Brad. We had taken something back, but as the adrenaline faded, one question loomed in my mind. At what cost? The next morning, everything began to unravel. The videos spread faster than I had anticipated. I hadn't fully considered how quickly something like that could go viral, but by midday the damage was undeniable. At the office, the whispers started. Brad was avoided like the plague, his colleagues throwing him side eyes when he wasn't looking. Paige wasn't spared either. Her once polished reputation was in tatters. Her colleagues stared at her with disgust, treating her like she was something to be erased. Brad was the first to crack. The company couldn't handle the scandal, not with someone like him at the center of it. They fired him quietly, trying to sweep the mess under the rug, but everyone knew what had happened. His career, years of effort, was obliterated. Paige wasn't far behind. The partners at her firm couldn't ignore the fallout. She wasn't just another associate anymore. She was the woman who had slept with a married man, her shame laid bare for everyone to see. Cold stares and whispers followed her wherever she went. The weight of her choices was finally crashing down on her, just as it had on me. Her career fell apart, and Brad's did too. I should have felt victorious, like I'd won, like justice had finally been served. But as I sat there watching it all unfold, the satisfaction I'd been expecting never came. Instead, I was left with a hollow feeling, a gnawing sense that in my pursuit of revenge, I had crossed a line. Had I become something darker? Someone I didn't recognize? I wasn't just the betrayed husband anymore. I was colder, harder, a version of myself that I wasn't sure I liked. And when I glanced at Ella, sitting next to me, staring blankly at her phone, I realized the truth. Revenge doesn't heal. It doesn't fill the void left by betrayal. It only leaves you with the wreckage of who you used to be. That night, when I walked through the door, Paige was waiting for me. She was pacing, frantic, her eyes wild with panic. The moment she saw me, she exploded. "Why, Oscar? Why would you do this?" she shouted, her voice trembling with a mix of fury and desperation. I stood there, staring at her, feeling nothing but disgust. "Why?" I repeated coldly. "You cheated, Paige. You thought you could walk all over me, and I'd just take it." Her face twisted with frustration, her hands gesturing wildly. "I didn't do it to hurt you. I did it for us. For you." Her words hit me like a slap, but not in the way she probably intended. They were absurd, almost laughable. "For me?" I snapped. "Are you serious? You slept with my boss because you thought it would help me? You're pathetic, Paige. Nothing justifies what you did." Tears began streaming down her face, but I felt nothing. No sympathy, no pity. Just the cold certainty that this was the end. Our marriage wasn't just broken. It was beyond saving. That moment was the final nail in the coffin. After that, everything moved quickly. The divorce was fast, no theatrics, no drawn-out fights. Just business. We sold the house, split the assets, and signed the papers. Once it was over, I packed up and left. I couldn't stay in that city, surrounded by memories of what we'd been and what she'd done. I needed to start over, far away from all of it. I moved back to my hometown. The air felt different there, lighter, cleaner. I found a simple job, nothing glamorous, but it was honest work. I started going to the gym again, reconnecting with old friends, and gradually piecing myself back together. Bit by bit, I began to feel like myself again. It took time, more than I expected, but the sting of betrayal faded. The memories of what Paige had done, the lies, the humiliation, the rage, It all started to feel less significant. I wasn't bitter anymore. I wasn't angry. I just wanted to move forward. And I did. I let go of the pain and the anger. I found peace in the quiet, in the simplicity of my new life. There were no more secrets, no more lies. What I'd been through had shaped me, made me stronger, but I wasn't defined by it anymore. Paige was just a chapter in my life, one that had come to an end. And now I was ready to write a new one. For the first time in years, I felt truly free.